A single moment witnessed by the wrong eyes can imprison two hearts more completely than any castle wall. The last rays of the summer sun spilled across the western cliffs of Port Ainslie, painting the sea below Castle Dunmere with molten gold as elegant carriages rolled one after another beneath towering stone arches wrapped in white climbing roses. The Grand Midsummer Ball had always been the social event that defined the season along Scotland's western coast, where dukes, counts, ambassadors, merchants, and celebrated artists gathered beneath glittering crystal chandeliers to exchange smiles that often concealed sharper intentions than any spoken insult. Rosalie Whitmore stepped through the entrance with measured grace, smoothing the pale blue silk of her evening gown before offering a courteous smile to the butler announcing each guest. Once, the Whitmore family had stood among the wealthiest houses in the region. Now, after years of financial decline, Rosalie earned quiet respect organizing musical evenings and preserving rare manuscripts for neighboring estates, accepting every invitation with dignity despite knowing that whispers often followed her wherever she went. She carried herself not with pride, but with quiet resilience, the kind that drew admiration from those who valued character over fortune. Across the magnificent ballroom, Rowan Ashcroft stood near the towering windows overlooking the restless sea. The Duke of Dunmere rarely attended celebrations longer than duty required, and tonight was no exception. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black evening coat, he appeared as composed as the marble statues lining the hall, his grey eyes reflecting the fading daylight beyond the glass. Society admired his discipline, his honor, and his unwavering devotion to preserving his family's reputation after years marked by personal loss. Yet very few noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression, or the loneliness that settled around him like the evening mist rolling over the cliffs outside. Music floated gently through the ballroom as couples glided across polished marble beneath countless candles whose warm glow softened the ancient stone walls. Rosalie greeted familiar faces with kindness, unaware that two elegantly dressed ladies stood only a few feet away, lowering their voices just enough to invite curiosity rather than concealment. "Have you noticed how often the Duke seems to appear wherever Miss Whitmore is invited?" one whispered behind a painted fan. "Perhaps His Grace has developed an interest he wishes to keep hidden," replied the other with a smile far sweeter than her intentions. Rumors were dangerous precisely because they required so little truth to survive. Within minutes, conversations shifted. Gentlemen glanced toward Rosalie. Ladies exchanged knowing looks. Servants carrying silver trays hesitated as fragments of speculation drifted through the enormous hall like invisible smoke. Rosalie sensed the change before understanding its cause. Faces that had greeted her warmly only moments earlier suddenly carried curious expressions. A distant laugh sounded sharper than before. She turned slightly, only to find several guests looking away too quickly. Confusion settled in her chest, followed by the familiar ache of humiliation she had learned to hide since her family's decline. Rowan noticed it as well. His steward quietly approached, murmuring just enough for the Duke alone to hear. "Your Grace, the guests believe you and Miss Whitmore arrived together in secret." Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who began this?" The steward lowered his eyes. "No one seems to know anymore." Rowan understood immediately. Rumors rarely had a single author once enough people found them entertaining. If left unanswered, they would not merely stain his own reputation. They would destroy hers. In their world, a gentleman might survive gossip. A lady often could not. Across the ballroom, Rosalie stood alone near the orchestra as conversations quietly faded around her. She lifted her chin despite the growing silence, refusing to let anyone witness the hurt gathering behind her composed expression. Rowan crossed the ballroom with calm, deliberate steps that drew every eye toward him. The orchestra continued playing, though several musicians exchanged uncertain glances as the Duke approached. Miss Whitmore without hesitation. Rosalie looked up, startled by his sudden presence. "Your Grace?" she whispered. Rowan held her gaze for one brief heartbeat. He saw confusion, dignity, and the quiet courage of someone preparing to endure another public embarrassment without complaint. In that single instant he made the only decision he believed could stop the wildfire consuming the room. Without speaking another word, he gently cupped her hand, leaned forward, and placed a brief, respectful kiss upon her lips. Time itself seemed to stop. The violins faltered into silence. Crystal glasses froze halfway toward waiting hands. Hundreds of eyes widened beneath shimmering chandeliers. Even the waves crashing against the cliffs below Castle Dunmere seemed suddenly distant. Rowan slowly stepped back, only then realizing what the stunned silence truly meant. He had hoped to end one rumor. Instead, every witness in the ballroom had just watched the unmarried Duke of Dunmere kiss Miss Rosalie Whitmore before all of high society. And in the world they lived in, there would be only one acceptable ending to the story everyone had just seen. Morning arrived beneath a sky veiled in silver clouds, yet no storm rolling across the sea could match the one already spreading through Port Ainslie. Before the bells of St. Aldwyn Chapel finished ringing the 8th hour, every drawing room, tea parlor, and merchant office carried a different version of the same astonishing story. Some claimed the Duke of Dunmere had secretly courted Miss Rosalie Whitmore for months. Others insisted the kiss had been a carefully planned announcement disguised as surprise. A few, eager for greater scandal, whispered that a wedding had already been arranged in secret and that the ballroom had merely witnessed what should have remained private. Truth disappeared beneath imagination with frightening speed. Rosalie sat beside the tall windows of Whitmore House, her untouched breakfast growing cold as waves crashed softly against the distant shoreline beyond the gardens. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the silent ballroom, the startled expressions, and Rowan stepping back with the same look of disbelief she herself had felt. She did not resent him. She believed he had acted without malice. Yet kindness could not erase consequences. Her aunt quietly entered carrying a folded invitation sealed with dark blue wax. She hesitated before placing it upon the breakfast table. "Another cancellation," she said gently. Rosalie looked down without reaching for the envelope. "The Ashcombe recital?" Her aunt nodded. "Lady Ashcombe regrets that recent circumstances have made the gathering unsuitable." Rosalie offered a faint smile that failed to reach her eyes. "She need not invent polite words. Society has already judged me." Across the bay, Castle Dunmere stood against the cliffs with the same solemn dignity it had displayed for generations. Rowan remained inside his library where heavy oak shelves surrounded a room filled with maps, journals, and family portraits whose painted eyes seemed to observe every decision made beneath their silent watch. His steward placed a stack of letters upon the desk. Each carried a distinguished seal. None contained ordinary correspondence. One came from the Royal Society of Nobles requesting clarification regarding the previous evening's public display. Another arrived from neighboring estates expressing surprise mixed with carefully disguised curiosity. A third, written by an elderly duchess whose opinion carried considerable influence, contained only one sentence. "A gentleman does not borrow a lady's honor unless he intends to protect it for life." Rowan read the line twice before quietly setting the letter aside. He had spent years preserving the Ashcroft name with patience, discipline, and restraint. One brief decision lasting only seconds had unraveled that certainty overnight. Yet every time he considered regretting his choice, he remembered Rosalie standing alone beneath the weight of those merciless whispers. Had he done nothing, society would have destroyed her anyway. A knock interrupted the silence. His longtime friend and legal adviser, Theodore Ellison, entered without ceremony. Theodore had known Rowan since childhood and possessed the rare privilege of speaking honestly without fear of rank. "You are not wondering whether people are talking," Theodore said calmly. "You are wondering how much damage has already been done." Rowan looked toward the rain beginning to strike the library windows. "Tell me." Theodore exhaled slowly. "Miss Whitmore has already lost professional invitations. Families are withdrawing from agreements. Her reputation is becoming the price paid for your decision." Rowan closed his eyes briefly. "And mine?" Theodore gave a sad smile. "They admire you even more." Rowan turned sharply. "For ruining her future?" "For appearing decisive," Theodore replied. "That is how unfair society has always been." Silence settled between them. Outside, gulls circled above the cliffs while gray waves rolled endlessly toward the rocks below. Finally, Theodore spoke again. There is only one path that restores her standing. Rowan already knew the answer before hearing it aloud. Marriage. The word echoed through the quiet room with greater weight than any command he had ever received. It was not merely a ceremony. It was a public declaration accepting lifelong responsibility before every family that had witnessed the ballroom. Theodore stepped closer. Do not ask yourself whether you love her. That question belongs to another day. Ask whether you can allow an innocent woman to carry this burden alone. Rowan walked toward the broad window overlooking the sea. Far below, the lighthouse stood against the relentless tide, unchanged by every storm that struck its walls. Duty often resembled that lonely tower. It did not ask whether sacrifice was convenient. It simply remained standing. Rowan rested one hand upon the cold glass and quietly reached his decision. Before another sunset touched the cliffs of Port Ainslie, he would go to Whitmore House himself. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. But with an offer that might save Rosalie's name even if it forever changed both of their lives. The carriage bearing the Ashcroft crest rolled slowly through the wrought iron gates of Whitmore House just before noon, its polished wheels whispering across the damp stone drive still glistening from the morning rain. Rowan remained seated for several moments after the horses stopped, staring through the window at the modest estate where roses climbed weathered walls that had clearly known more prosperous days. The house lacked the grandeur of Castle Dunmere, yet it possessed something his ancestral home had long forgotten. Warmth. Open windows welcomed the scent of the sea. Wind chimes stirred gently beneath the porch. Somewhere beyond the gardens, someone was playing a piano with quiet determination rather than polished perfection. The melody lingered in the air like hope refusing to surrender. Rowan stepped onto the stone path, removing his gloves as the butler greeted him with visible surprise. Within minutes he found himself waiting inside a drawing room lined with aging bookshelves, watercolor paintings, and carefully restored furniture whose imperfections had been preserved rather than hidden. Every detail reflected Rosalie's quiet character. Nothing demanded admiration, yet everything invited respect. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Rosalie entered wearing a simple ivory day dress without jewels or ornament, her golden brown hair gathered neatly behind her shoulders. She had always carried herself with dignity, but today something fragile rested beneath her calm expression. She stopped several feet away and offered the proper courtesy due to his rank. Your Grace. Rowan bowed his head. Miss Whitmore. Silence settled between them. Outside, waves rolled steadily against the cliffs beyond Port Ainslie while sunlight slowly pushed through thinning clouds. Rowan realized he had negotiated trade agreements, estate disputes, and parliamentary debates with greater confidence than he now possessed standing before one quiet woman. Rosalie spared him the discomfort first. You did not come merely to ask whether I am well, Rowan answered honestly. No. She nodded faintly. Neither of us has the luxury of pretending ordinary conversation is possible anymore. He admired the courage hidden inside her gentle voice. She neither blamed nor accused him. Somehow that made his task even harder. Rowan took one measured breath. Everything that has happened since the ball is my responsibility. Rosalie lowered her eyes briefly. Responsibility is not always the same as intention. Perhaps not, Rowan replied. But intention changes very little for the person carrying the consequences. Her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the small book she held. You owe me no apology for acting with kindness. Rowan looked at her with quiet disbelief. Kindness? Rosalie met his gaze. You believed you were protecting me from cruel gossip. I understood that the moment it happened. Her voice softened. The tragedy is that neither of us understood what society would choose to see. Rowan felt something shift within him. Since the previous evening everyone had spoken about reputation, appearances, and noble obligations. Rosalie alone had spoken about intention. About humanity. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully removed a folded document bearing his family seal before placing it upon the small table between them. I have come because there is only one path left that restores your standing completely. Rosalie looked at the untouched paper but made no effort to open it. She already knew what it contained. A marriage proposal, she said quietly. Rowan nodded once. Yes. Another long silence followed. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing second with patient certainty. Finally Rosalie smiled, though sadness rested within it like winter beneath clear skies. You speak as though you are presenting terms before a court. Rowan's shoulders lowered slightly. Perhaps I am. Because you believe duty demands it. Because honor demands it. Rosalie gently placed her book upon the table beside the sealed document. And what does your heart demand? Rowan found no answer. Not because he wished to deceive her, but because the question reached somewhere he had carefully avoided for years. Rosalie stood and walked toward the open window where sea breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming roses into the room. When I was a little girl, she said softly without turning around, my father once told me that the saddest marriages begin with gratitude instead of love. Rowan remained silent. He said gratitude fades once sacrifice becomes ordinary. She finally faced him again, her blue eyes calm despite the emotion hidden within them. If I accept because you feel guilty, eventually you will resent me. If you marry because society commands it, eventually I will resent myself. Rowan stepped forward instinctively. I would never treat you without respect. I know. Her smile returned, gentle but resolute. That is precisely why I cannot accept. Rowan stared at her, momentarily unable to speak. Every advisor, every noble family, every letter arriving at Castle Dunmere had assumed any woman placed in Rosalie's position would immediately welcome the protection his name could offer. Instead, she quietly defended not only her own dignity, but his freedom as well. Rosalie carefully lifted the unopened proposal and placed it back into his hands. When you ask again one day, she whispered with unwavering grace, let it be because you choose me, not because the ballroom chose for you. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet cruelty of a tide that never seemed to retreat. Every morning another letter arrived at Whitmore House, and every evening another opportunity quietly disappeared. Invitations once offered with enthusiasm were withdrawn with polished courtesy. Concert committees selected different organizers. Patrons who had praised Rosalie's work only weeks earlier now claimed their schedules had become unexpectedly full. None of them spoke openly of disgrace. They did not need to. Silence often carried sharper judgment than words. Rosalie accepted every disappointment with the same calm smile, thanking each messenger before placing the unopened envelopes inside the drawer of her writing desk. She refused to let anyone witness the small heartbreak hidden behind each graceful gesture. Her aunt watched helplessly as the pile of sealed letters continued to grow, knowing every elegant apology represented another door closing upon the future Rosalie had built through years of patient work. At Castle Dunmere, Rowan found little peace despite throwing himself into estate business from dawn until long after sunset. Reports covered his desk, tenants awaited decisions, and repairs along the western harbor demanded immediate attention, yet every task dissolved beneath the memory of Rosalie returning his proposal without anger, without accusation, and without asking anything for herself. She had protected his freedom even while her own world quietly unraveled. Theodore Ellison stood beside the library fireplace studying another document recently delivered from the Royal Society of Nobles. This will not end by itself, he said quietly. Rowan did not look up from the map spread across his desk. Read it. Theodore unfolded the letter. The Society has postponed the annual charitable trusteeship election. Several members believe the Whitmore family no longer reflects the dignity expected of those serving the public. Rowan slowly raised his head. Rosalie has spent years raising funds for orphan schools and restoring historical archives. Facts rarely defeat appearances, Theodore answered gently. Especially when appearances entertain people. Rowan closed the ledger before him. The sound echoed through the silent library with unexpected force. She is being punished for my decision. Theodore nodded. And every day you hesitate, the punishment becomes easier for others to justify. That afternoon Rowan rode alone along the coastal road overlooking Port Ainslie. The sea stretched endlessly beneath heavy grey skies while white gulls circled above fishing boats, returning toward the harbor. He had spent most of his life believing honor meant protecting tradition, preserving duty, and never allowing emotion to cloud judgment. Yet nothing about the present situation resembled honor. Rosalie had done nothing except refuse to let bitterness define her. Still, she alone carried the burden. Meanwhile, his own reputation remained almost untouched. The imbalance unsettled him more deeply than any scandal could have. Across town, Rosalie stood inside St. Aldwyn Chapel arranging fresh white lilies before the altar, as she had done every Thursday for nearly 3 years. The quiet sanctuary had always offered refuge from restless thoughts, but even here whispers found their way through stained glass and ancient stone. 2 elderly parish ladies entered carrying prayer books, lowering their voices. Just enough to believe they remained unheard. "Such a shame," one murmured. "If only she had accepted the Duke immediately." The other sighed. "Pride is expensive for families without fortune." Rosalie continued arranging flowers without lifting her eyes, though every word settled gently upon her heart. She did not blame them. They repeated only what society had already decided to believe. When the women departed, Reverend Alden approached quietly from the side aisle. He had known Rosalie since childhood and recognized the strength hidden beneath her composed silence. "You cannot carry every burden alone, my dear," he said softly. Rosalie smiled with quiet gratitude. "I know. Then why do you keep trying?" She looked toward the sunlight filtering through stained glass, scattering colors across the worn stone floor. "Because if I surrender my peace to the opinions of strangers, then they will have taken far more than my reputation." The Reverend remained silent for several moments before speaking again. "Sometimes accepting help is not surrender. Sometimes it is an act of courage." Those words lingered in Rosalie's thoughts long after she returned home. That evening she found her aunt sitting alone beside the fireplace holding a stack of unpaid household accounts. The older woman tried to hide them beneath a folded shawl, but Rosalie had already seen enough. Heating expenses had increased. Income from cancelled engagements had vanished. Repairs to the aging roof would have to wait another winter. The family had survived hardship before, yet for the first time Rosalie realized that her refusal no longer affected only herself. It threatened the people who had sacrificed everything to preserve her dignity. Outside, twilight settled over Port Ainslie as Rowan's carriage quietly approached Whitmore House once again. This time he carried no prepared speech and no carefully written proposal. He carried only a simple conviction that had grown stronger with every passing hour. Whatever choice awaited him beyond those familiar gates, he would no longer allow Rosalie to stand alone before a society that had mistaken her grace for weakness. Rowan stepped into the drawing room just as the evening light faded beyond the tall windows, leaving the house wrapped in the quiet glow of oil lamps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below Port Ainslie. Rosalie rose from her chair with the same composed dignity she had shown during every difficult conversation they had shared, yet this time she immediately noticed something different. Rowan carried no leather portfolio, no folded documents, no prepared proposal bearing the Ashcroft seal. His hands were empty. He stopped several feet away, allowing the silence to settle naturally between them before speaking. "I came today without conditions," he said softly, "and without expecting forgiveness." Rosalie searched his face, finding neither the certainty of a duke nor the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. She saw only sincerity wrapped in quiet exhaustion. "Then why have you come?" she asked. Rowan looked briefly toward the rain-speckled garden outside before answering. "Because I finally understand that I have been asking the wrong question." She remained silent, inviting him to continue. "I believed I needed to know whether I loved you before asking you to marry me." His voice remained calm, but every word carried unusual honesty. "The truth is that love cannot grow while one person is carrying every sacrifice alone. What I should have asked is whether I have the courage to stand beside you regardless of what my heart has already decided or may decide in time." Rosalie lowered her eyes for a moment, feeling those words settle somewhere deeper than she expected. They were imperfect, uncertain, and entirely human. For the first time, Rowan was no longer speaking as the Duke of Dunmere. He was speaking simply as a man. Before she could answer, footsteps hurried through the hallway. Her aunt entered holding another sealed letter, though her expression revealed its importance long before she spoke. "Rosalie." Her voice trembled gently. "The Historical Arts Council has officially removed you from the Restoration Committee." The older woman hesitated before continuing. "They have also withdrawn next season's funding for the Whitmore Music Society." The room became very still. Rosalie accepted the letter without opening it. She already knew what it contained. Another carefully worded rejection. Another graceful dismissal disguised as concern for public appearances. Rowan felt something tighten within him. He had believed the damage severe before. Now he realized it was spreading beyond one woman's reputation. It threatened the charitable work she had devoted years to building, the livelihoods of local musicians, and the future of projects that served children throughout the county. He looked at Rosalie, expecting anger or despair. Instead, she folded the unopened letter and quietly placed it beside the others resting neatly upon the writing desk. "There is no need to read every farewell," she said with a gentle smile. "Most of them say exactly the same thing." Rowan could no longer remain still. He crossed the room and stopped beside the desk where dozens of unopened envelopes rested in perfect order, each representing another piece of her former life quietly disappearing. "How many?" he asked. Rosalie glanced at the stack. "I stopped counting after 20. His eyes lingered on the faded ribbons tied around old music programs and handwritten notes, from children thanking her for restoring their school library. Everything she had built through kindness was being erased by people who had never questioned the truth for even a single day. Rowan finally understood that this was never simply about repairing one woman's public image. It was about protecting the goodness she had given to others long before he entered her life. He slowly turned toward Rosalie. "You once told me that if I asked again, it should be because I chose you." She nodded almost imperceptibly. Rowan drew one slow breath. "Then hear me carefully." His voice remained quiet, yet every word carried unwavering conviction. "I choose the woman who continued arranging flowers inside the chapel after strangers judged her. I choose the woman who thanked servants by name when everyone else overlooked them. I choose the woman who protected my freedom even while losing her own future. If you refuse me again, I will accept it with respect. But I will not pretend that this is only duty anymore." Rosalie felt tears threaten for the first time since the ballroom, yet she refused to let them fall. She had spent days believing she was fighting alone against a tide too powerful to resist. Now she saw something changing within the man standing before her. Not sudden romance. Not dramatic passion. Something quieter. Something stronger. Respect becoming admiration. Responsibility becoming devotion. Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the front hall. The butler entered with unusual hesitation, carrying a silver tray upon which rested an envelope sealed with deep crimson wax rather than the familiar blue or black of neighboring estates. "This arrived by special courier only moments ago," he said. Rowan accepted the letter, immediately recognizing neither the crest nor the handwriting. As he broke the unfamiliar seal, a single folded page slipped into his hand. His expression changed almost instantly. The anonymous message contained only one sentence written in careful script. "If you truly wish to know who began the rumor, stop looking at the ballroom and start looking at those who needed the Duke to marry someone else." The anonymous letter remained upon Rowan's desk long after midnight, its single sentence carrying greater weight than pages filled with accusations ever could. Outside Castle Dunmere, the lighthouse swept its steady beam across the restless sea while rain drifted softly against the tall windows of the octagonal library. Rowan had read the message countless times, searching for hidden meaning between the carefully chosen words. Someone had not merely spread idle gossip. Someone had planned every step, knowing exactly how society would react, knowing exactly how he would respond if Rosalie's reputation appeared threatened. Theodore Ellison stood beside the fireplace, studying the crimson wax seal beneath a magnifying lens. This crest does not belong to any noble family in the western counties, he observed quietly. Whoever sent it wished to remain hidden, but they also wished to be believed. Rowan folded the letter carefully. Then someone wants the truth discovered. Theodore looked up. Or someone wants you looking in the wrong direction. Silence settled between them before Rowan spoke again. The message says someone needed me to marry another woman. Theodore nodded slowly. Then perhaps the answer is not among those who envied Miss Whitmore. Perhaps it lies among those who expected to become the Duchess of Dunmere. The thought lingered as dawn broke across the cliffs. By early morning, Rowan quietly cancelled 2 estate meetings and traveled instead to the county archives overlooking the harbor. There, surrounded by shelves filled with family records and charitable endowments, he requested invitations, guest lists, and correspondence connected to the grand midsummer ball. The elderly archivist appeared surprised by the unusual request but offered every document without question. Hours passed while Rowan examined names, seating arrangements, and sponsorship agreements. Gradually one pattern emerged. Several influential families had spent months encouraging a marriage between Rowan and Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, the wealthy daughter of an Eastern duke whose commercial interests would have greatly expanded Dunmere's shipping routes. Rowan had politely declined every introduction. He had assumed the matter ended there. Now he was no longer certain. Meanwhile, Rosalie refused to surrender to disappointment. Although nearly every formal engagement had vanished, she continued visiting St. Aldwyn Chapel each Thursday, arranging flowers before the morning service and spending afternoons reading to children whose parents worked along the harbor. None of the children asked about scandal. None cared about noble gossip. They welcomed her with the same bright smiles they always had, eager to hear stories about explorers, inventors, and distant lands beyond the sea. Their innocence reminded Rosalie that kindness did not require public approval. As she left the small parish school carrying a basket of borrowed books, she noticed an elderly gardener struggling to lift heavy pots outside the village greenhouse. Without hesitation, she set down her own belongings and helped him carry each flowering plant beneath the covered walkway before another rain shower arrived. "You should not trouble yourself with such work, Miss Whitmore," the gardener said gratefully. Rosalie smiled as she brushed soil from her gloves. Helping someone rarely becomes trouble. Neither of them realized a carriage had paused quietly across the street. Rowan watched the entire scene through the rain-speckled window without announcing his presence. He had intended only to ensure Rosalie arrived safely home after hearing rumors that curious strangers had begun lingering near Whitmore House. Instead, he witnessed something entirely different. She believed no one important was watching. She expected no reward. Yet she still offered her time, her strength, and her patience to a man society barely noticed. Theodore's words echoed faintly in Rowan's memory. "Ask whether you can stand beside the woman she truly is." Rowan finally understood that every remarkable quality drawing him toward Rosalie had existed long before one impulsive moment in the ballroom. The scandal had not created her character. It had merely revealed it to him. That evening he requested a private meeting with Lady Beatrice Hawthorne at the conservatory adjoining the Ashcroft family's charitable museum. Lady Beatrice arrived precisely on time, graceful and impeccably dressed, greeting Rowan with practiced elegance. "Your Grace," she said warmly. "I was pleased to receive your invitation." Rowan remained courteous but direct. "I need your honesty." A faint shadow crossed her expression. "About Miss Whitmore?" Rowan studied her carefully. "About the rumor that began before the ball." Lady Beatrice's smile faded almost imperceptibly. She turned toward the glass walls where rain traced slow silver lines across the panes. "People often hear what they already wish to believe," she answered softly. Rowan remained still. "That was not my question." Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. "No, it was not." When she finally looked back at him, her calm composure carried the unmistakable weight of someone deciding whether to protect a secret or reveal it. "If I tell you who first whispered Rosalie Whitmore's name that evening," she said quietly, "you must promise me one thing." Rowan met her gaze without hesitation. "Name it." Lady Beatrice drew a slow breath. Promise that when you discover the truth, you will remember that not every betrayal begins with hatred. Sometimes it begins with desperation. Lady Beatrice remained silent for several seconds, listening to the rain tapping gently against the conservatory glass before finally lifting her eyes to meet Rowan's. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet resignation. The rumor did not begin with me, she said softly, but I know where it first took shape. Rowan waited without interruption. Lady Beatrice slowly walked toward a bed of white orchids blooming beneath the glass ceiling. 3 days before the ball, several families gathered for a private luncheon at Ashcombe Manor. The conversation turned toward your future. Everyone assumed that sooner or later you would agree to a political marriage. She paused before continuing. When someone mentioned that you had recently attended 2 charitable events where Miss Whitmore happened to be present, Lady Eleanor Radcliffe laughed and said perhaps your heart had already chosen a bride without consulting society. Rowan frowned slightly. A careless joke. Yes, Lady Beatrice replied. At first. She folded her hands calmly before her. But another guest suggested that if such a story reached enough ears before the ball, perhaps your pride would force you to deny it publicly. They expected you to distance yourself from Miss Whitmore in front of everyone. Once that happened, no one would dare connect your names again, and the pressure for a different marriage would quietly resume. Rowan stood perfectly still. Every piece suddenly began falling into place. The rumor itself had never been the true objective. It had merely been bait. His own decision inside the ballroom had destroyed the carefully prepared outcome by protecting Rosalie instead of rejecting her. Lady Beatrice looked toward the rain once more. No one imagined you would do what you did. Rowan quietly nodded. Neither did I. As he left the conservatory, another realization settled over him with increasing certainty. Whoever had started the whisper had underestimated one person completely. Rosalie. They had assumed she would break beneath public judgment, disappear quietly from society, and allow events to move on without resistance. Instead, she had met every insult with dignity so unwavering that even those who doubted her privately struggled to justify their own behavior. Meanwhile, Rosalie spent the afternoon inside the village reading room where several local children gathered each week to borrow books she had personally restored over the past 3 years. Their laughter echoed warmly through the modest stone building as rain continued falling beyond the windows. One little girl carefully handed Rosalie a worn adventure novel. Miss Whitmore, she asked innocently, are you coming next Thursday too? Rosalie smiled gently. If you still need someone to read stories. The child laughed. We always will. That simple answer warmed her heart more deeply than any invitation from the grandest ballroom ever had. As the children departed one by one beneath colorful umbrellas, Reverend Alden approached carrying a folded newspaper recently delivered from Edinburgh. His expression carried quiet concern. I thought you should see this before someone else brings it to your door. Rosalie accepted the paper. Across the society page appeared another carefully written article discussing the Duke of Dunmere and the unfortunate consequences of recent public misunderstandings. Although no names were directly condemned, the implication remained unmistakable. Anonymous sources now claimed Miss Whitmore had deliberately sought opportunities to attract the Duke's attention long before the summer ball. Rosalie slowly folded the newspaper without allowing disappointment to appear upon her face. It seems the story has found another chapter. Reverend Alden sighed. Lies often become bolder when they begin losing their audience. At nearly the same moment, Rowan's carriage reached the newspaper office overlooking Port Ainslie Harbour. Without announcing his arrival beforehand, he entered the editor's office where startled clerks immediately stood. The editor himself, Mr. Harold Winslow, hurried forward. With practiced courtesy. Your Grace, what an unexpected honor! Rowan placed the freshly printed newspaper upon the desk. Who supplied this story? Mr. Winslow hesitated. Society columns often rely upon confidential correspondence. Rowan's calm expression never changed. Then allow me to clarify one fact for your next edition. The office fell completely silent. Rowan spoke neither loudly nor angrily. His voice remained steady enough that every employee heard each word with perfect clarity. Miss Rosalie Whitmore never pursued my attention. If blame belongs anywhere, it belongs entirely to me. Any publication suggesting otherwise publishes falsehood rather than reporting. Mr. Winslow swallowed quietly. Your Grace, such a public statement will certainly encourage speculation. Rowan looked directly into his eyes. Then print this as well. I will not permit another word that questions Miss Whitmore's character while mine remains untouched. By sunset, news of the Duke's unexpected visit spread through Port Ainslie even faster than the rumors had. For the first time since the ballroom, society witnessed something it had not expected. Rowan Ashcroft was no longer merely accepting responsibility. He was openly standing between Rosalie and every accusation directed toward her. And somewhere beyond the harbor, hidden behind carefully guarded respectability, the person who had believed whispers alone could shape two destinies began to realize that the story was no longer unfolding according to plan. The morning edition of every newspaper along the western coast carried Rowan Ashcroft's public statement before the sun had fully climbed above the sea. By noon, conversations that had once revolved around Rosalie Whitmore's supposed ambition began shifting toward a far more uncomfortable question. If the Duke himself insisted she had done nothing wrong, then who had benefited from convincing society otherwise? The certainty that had fueled so many whispered judgments slowly began to fracture. Within drawing rooms and elegant gardens, confident gossip gave way to cautious silence. No one wished to discover they had repeated a lie crafted for someone else's advantage. At Castle Dunmere, Rowan met privately with Theodore Ellison and Lady Beatrice Hawthorne. Together they reviewed every invitation, every guest list, and every account connected to the grand midsummer ball. The pattern that had first appeared as coincidence now revealed careful design. Lady Eleanor Radcliffe had personally encouraged several influential hostesses to repeat the original rumor before the evening festivities. Anonymous notes had quietly reached newspaper columnists the following morning. Even the unfortunate article suggesting Rosalie had pursued the Duke relied upon information traced back to the same social circle. None of it proved criminal wrongdoing. Yet it revealed something equally powerful. The scandal had never grown naturally. It had been carefully cultivated until it seemed impossible to question. Lady Beatrice lowered a small bundle of correspondence onto the library table. I kept these because something about the timing always troubled me, she admitted. Rowan unfolded the letters one by one. Several contained invitations urging him to spend time with Lady Eleanor's wealthy relatives immediately after the summer ball, as though the outcome of the evening had already been anticipated. Theodore quietly exhaled. Someone expected Miss Whitmore to be publicly embarrassed, not publicly defended. Rowan looked toward the storm clouds gathering beyond the cliffs. And when that plan failed, they simply changed the story. Across Port Ainslie, Rosalie continued her ordinary routine despite knowing little about the growing investigation. She spent the afternoon helping restore damaged hymn books inside St. Aldwyn Chapel while children practiced songs for the upcoming harvest celebration. The familiar work steadied her thoughts. She had learned that peace rarely arrived by waiting for the world to become fair. It arrived through choosing kindness even when fairness seemed absent. As she finished placing the final repaired volume upon a shelf, Reverend Alden approached carrying a sealed envelope unlike the many painful letters she had received in recent weeks. This one arrived by personal courier, he said gently. Rosalie opened it carefully. Inside rested a formal notice from the Historical Arts Council. After reviewing newly presented testimony, the Council acknowledged that recent decisions regarding her dismissal had been based upon unverified public speculation rather than established fact. Her position, funding, and responsibilities were immediately restored. Rosalie read the letter twice before quietly closing her eyes. She felt no desire for triumph. Only relief. Not because her reputation had begun healing, but because the schools, musicians, and restoration projects she loved would continue serving the community. When she stepped outside the chapel, Rowan stood waiting beneath the old stone archway overlooking the sea. Neither of them spoke immediately. The wind carried the scent of salt and wild roses through the quiet afternoon. Rosalie finally held up the letter with a gentle smile. Someone has begun correcting old mistakes. Rowan returned the smile, though sadness remained in his eyes. Not quickly enough. She looked at him with quiet gratitude. You did not have to stand before everyone for my sake. Rowan answered without hesitation. Yes, I did. They walked slowly toward the cliff path overlooking the harbor where fishing boats drifted peacefully below. For several minutes they spoke only about ordinary things, the changing weather, the lighthouse repairs, and the children's harvest concert. It felt strangely comforting to leave scandal behind, if only for a little while. At last Rosalie stopped beside a weathered stone bench facing the sea. I owe you my thanks, she said softly. Rowan shook his head. No. You owe me nothing. She studied the horizon before speaking again. The council has restored my work. People are beginning to reconsider what they believed. Everything that first seemed impossible is slowly returning. Rowan noticed an unfamiliar distance beneath her calm voice. Yet? Rosalie folded the letter carefully and held it close. Yet I believe it is time for me to leave Port Ainslie for a while. Rowan stared at her in stunned silence. Leave? She nodded gently. An old colleague has invited me to help restore a coastal library farther north. The work will last several months. Rowan's heart sank with unexpected force. Because of everything that happened? Rosalie looked at him with kindness rather than sorrow. Because I finally have the freedom to choose my own path again. She paused before continuing. The woman who accepts your hand one day should never wonder whether she remained because she had nowhere else to go. Rowan searched her face, suddenly realizing that the moment he had feared without naming it had quietly arrived. Rosalie's reputation was healing. Her future was returning. And for the first time since the ballroom, she no longer needed saving. She simply smiled, wished him peace, and began walking slowly down the cliff road toward Whitmore House while the evening tide rolled steadily against the rocks below, leaving Rowan standing alone beneath the gray sky with one painful certainty growing stronger inside him. If he allowed her to leave now, he would not be losing a responsibility. He would be losing the woman he had quietly come to love. The harbor of Port Ainslie awakened beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain, where pale morning light shimmered across the sea and transformed every wave into silver. Fishing boats drifted gently beyond the stone pier while travelers gathered beside waiting carriages and steamships preparing for journeys that would carry them far beyond the western coast. Rosalie Whitmore stood quietly with a single leather case resting beside her feet, her gloved hands folded calmly before her, as she watched gulls circle above the lighthouse. She had spent the previous evening saying farewell to the children at the parish school, to the elderly gardener whose greenhouse now overflowed with blooming roses, and to every familiar place that had shaped the happiest and most difficult season of her life. She carried no bitterness with her. Only gratitude and peace. Sometimes the bravest choice was not remaining where memories lingered but allowing hope to lead somewhere new. The whistle of the coastal steamer echoed across the harbor just as footsteps approached behind her. She did not turn immediately because somehow she already knew who had come. Rowan Ashcroft stopped several feet away, his dark coat moving gently in the ocean breeze as he looked not at the waiting ship but at the woman who had quietly changed everything he believed about duty, honor, and love. Either of them hurried to speak. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. At last Rowan stepped closer. If I allow you to board that ship without saying what should have been said long ago, I will spend the rest of my life wondering why I mistook fear for wisdom. Rosalie slowly faced him, her blue eyes reflecting both tenderness and quiet sadness. Your Grace. Rowan smiled faintly and gently shook his head. Not today! He reached into his coat and carefully withdrew the folded proposal she had once returned unopened. The edges had softened from being carried so many times. The first time I came to your home, I offered marriage because society expected it. The second time, I offered it because responsibility demanded it. Today I ask for neither reason. He looked directly into her eyes with a steadiness she had never seen before. Today I ask because every place I visit reminds me of you. Every act of kindness I witness reminds me of you. Every future I imagine feels incomplete unless you are standing beside me. You told me that if I ever asked again, it must be because I chose you. Rosalie, I have already made that choice. Tears gathered softly in Rosalie's eyes, but this time she did not hide them. They were not tears of humiliation or loss. They were the quiet tears that sometimes arrived when truth finally caught up with the heart. She looked down at the familiar document before gently pushing it back toward him. Rowan's expression briefly clouded with disappointment until she smiled through those shining eyes. I do not need the paper anymore, she whispered. I already believe the man holding it. Rowan let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Their fingers met with quiet certainty while the harbor continued its ordinary morning around them. Nearby travelers paused, recognizing the Duke and the woman whose names had filled so many conversations over recent weeks. Once again dozens of eyes turned toward them. Yet everything felt different now. There were no whispers powerful enough to separate two people who had finally learned to trust one another more than public opinion. Rowan lifted Rosalie's hand gently and said with complete sincerity, Will you marry me, not because anyone expects it, not because anyone demands it, but because together we can build a life that neither rumor nor fear will ever define? Rosalie smiled with the warmth that had first transformed forgotten libraries, quiet chapels, and lonely hearts long before either of them understood what destiny had begun. Yes, she answered softly. Because I choose you too. The harbor bells rang in the distance as though joining the moment. Rowan leaned forward and kissed her gently, not to silence gossip, not to satisfy expectation, but simply because there were no longer any words capable of expressing what had quietly grown between them. Around them, those who had once believed the worst lowered their eyes in thoughtful silence while others offered genuine smiles. Weeks later, the wedding at St. Aldwyn Chapel welcomed not only nobles but schoolchildren, gardeners, fishermen, musicians, librarians, and every ordinary soul whose life Rosalie had touched through simple acts of kindness. Castle Dunmere slowly changed after she arrived, its once solemn halls filled again with music, fresh flowers, laughter, and open doors welcoming the community rather than shutting it away. Rowan discovered that leadership became lighter when shared with someone who understood compassion as deeply as responsibility. Rosalie restored the great octagonal library overlooking the sea, creating scholarships, music programs, and reading rooms that carried hope to villages throughout the western coast. Years later, visitors would sometimes ask how the Duke and Duchess of Dunmere first fell in love. Rowan would smile quietly before looking toward Rosalie, who always answered the same way. The world believed one moment had ruined our lives. It turned out that moment only revealed the courage we had not yet discovered within ourselves. And as the evening sun settled beyond the cliffs, bathing Castle Dunmere in golden light, while waves whispered endlessly below, it became clear that love had never entered their lives through comfort or perfect timing. It arrived when two honorable hearts chose truth over fear, kindness over pride, and each other over the opinions of the world.